Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community.
Sure. It's a bit of a long story, so I'll try to do my best. But I have been working with individuals with visual impairments since I was 18 years old. So I did my undergrad at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. I'm originally from Massachusetts, and I had the experience of getting a job at our Office of Disability Services on campus. And UMass Amherst is a state school with probably about 40,000 students when I was there. And we had quite a large population of students with visual and all kinds of disabilities. And so my first boss um, kind of inspired me. She had macular degeneration, so she had been blind since she was about 25 years old. And I kind of, over time, I started at the front desk and I would sort of, you know, support the staff and kind of do administrative duties. And then over time, we like kind of our relationship grew, myself and my boss, and she had a caseload of students who all had some sort of sensory disability. So usually a visual impairment, some of them with multiple impairments. And so I kind of became her like right hand person, kind of her assistant almost. And I would work to procure materials for our blind and visually impaired students, for their coursework, or if we had students that needed accessible classrooms, that kind of thing, getting their course materials in braille or on audio, or whatever the thing may be that they needed, and technology and those type of supports. So I did that for quite a long time during my undergrad, and I majored. My background is in journalism, so I actually never sort of considered being a teacher or doing anything like that. But I had really enjoyed working with students with disabilities. And when I graduated, I went to go work for a very small newspaper outside of Worcester, Massachusetts. And though I liked the work and I liked writing and I liked communicating with folks and learning how to tell a story, um, my boss wasn't that supportive of a person. And I also just kind of missed working with students, and working with folks with disabilities who really were just so wonderful and so adaptive. And then I would spend this time in like town hall meetings as a reporter, and people would be fighting about things that I just felt were pretty inconsequential. And I kind of missed that kind of, I guess, inspiring environment that I had worked in with students. So I went to work. I had a friend who worked at the Perkins School for the Blind in Watertown, Massachusetts, and I got a job in their deaf-blind program. So my first kind of real full-on experience with individuals with disabilities was working in the deaf-blind program at Perkins as a residential aide, and I also got to spend time in classrooms, and kind of got to know how to, just how instruction worked for individuals with deaf blindness. And I did a lot of like residential sort of like rehab stuff with my students. And then I moved to Vermont, and I got a job as a paraeducator in an elementary school working with a student who had autism and blindness, and another student with some different disorders. And during that time, the folks that worked with my student, who were I'm a teacher of the visually impaired by trade. That's kind of what my certification is. And the folks who worked with my student were like, "Oh, you worked at Perkins, and which is kind of a big famous blind school. And you're really good with students. Have you considered getting your master's degree? You could become a special educator, and you can do it for free." And I was like, "That seems like a great idea." So at the time, we had a federally funded program at UMass Boston. And so I enrolled in that, and I became a teacher of the visually impaired. And I've been working with folks with disabilities, since then. My mother is mobility impaired. And so I'm the child of a person with a lifelong chronic illness, and physical disability as well. She uses a wheelchair. So I kind of wanted to take the frame of mind that I feel like my mom, kind of instilled in me, but also all the ways in which she wasn't afforded to kind of have an accessible life, and kind of thrive and meet her own goals and expectations. I think her disability really kind of set her back in ways that it didn't have to, if that makes sense. And so I wanted to be able to provide support to folks so that that didn't happen to them, and they could, they could thrive. And I often explain to people it's really no different, from anyone else. It's just kind of providing access and support so that everybody can be successful. And so I've worked as a teacher of the visually impaired for about 14 years off and on. I've also worked in tech. And I've also currently I work at the University of Washington in the Herring Center for Inclusion, where we kind of promote and provide professional development on inclusive practices for both special educators and general educators, and kind of a spectrum of different folks in education.
Cool.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. So tell me a little bit about your research, because you worked with visually impaired folks. So like
Mhm.
what sorts of things do you focus on in your research?
Sure. So my area of expertise is in something called cerebral or cortical visual impairment. So you see with your brain, you don't see with your eyes. So when you have a neurological impact, whether it be a traumatic brain injury or the onset of a serious disease, neurologically at birth, if your brain is underdeveloped, if you've had a lack of oxygen or bleeding in the brain very, very early in development, then there are differences in the way that you process visual information. And so this is just kind of my passion, because I worked at the New Mexico School for the Blind for 9 years, and I taught preschoolers and kindergartners with this particular visual impairment. So if I don't know if you know anything about blindness, but it's a very low incidence disability. So it's extremely rare to be totally blind and what I would refer to as cognitively intact, kind of not have other multiple disabilities. And I got to a spot where I would transition my students from my school for the blind, which is a very kind of honestly restrictive environment for children with disabilities. But because we have highly specialized services, we kind of would do our best. And it was a setting that provided them with a lot of resources that they wouldn't have if they didn't go to school. So it's kind of giving them a leg up and letting them start early in preschool and kindergarten, so that eventually they could transition into public school systems, and they would go there with like a very comprehensive like assessment, and people would understand, oh, this is how we teach them to read, or they're braille users or whatever. So over time, though, I realized that with many of my students with this particular with CVI, so you'll hear it referred to as CVI. We also call it neurological visual impairment. NVI, we also call it brain-based visual impairment. We use a bunch of different terms, but CVI is kind of the most well-known. um, so with CVI, it's kind of almost like an invisible disability. One of the hallmarks is that there's really nothing wrong with the anterior portion of the eye. So you don't, it's not like you notice it like glaucoma or cataracts, or, something that's really evident, or a retinal disease. And so there's really nothing wrong with the health of the eye itself. The eye is fine, but it's about that signal from the eyes to the brain. Okay. So what would happen was I would transition children from my little classroom in this place where everyone kind of understood that disability, to the public school system, where I felt like they would be labeled with behaviors, communication, autism spectrum disorders, this type of thing, behavioral disabilities, when really what they needed was someone who could understand that with just a couple of strategies and adaptations, they could really learn to read, or, be able to communicate effectively, stuff like that, and use function basically, and not be labeled with things that perhaps would be wrong for them, and kind of like take them in a direction that maybe they didn't need to go. So that was kind of my inspiration, and so I pursued my PhD, and my area of study is CVI. And so I work with I'm a consultant for the Anchor Center for Blind Children in Denver, Colorado. And we do work and are working on a research project that involves basically a screening tool that kind of will show red flags for neurological visual impairment in very, very little babies. And so that's a very exciting project. And I don't know if you're aware, but for children with or for babies, there's a hearing screening to check and make sure your hearing is okay, but we don't have one for vision. And so that's kind of what our goal is to provide babies that are born and perhaps they're born premature. That makes up a very large portion of kind of the children that we serve. Basically, we're working on kind of the identification and diagnoses in a more kind of comprehensive way of CVI and spreading awareness about it. So the idea is that for every one person that's diagnosed with it, there are 200 people that have it. And so it's a very kind of large scale, people, experts in the field have called it basically a public health crisis, which sounds a little dramatic, but there are a lot of people out there that have, brain injuries or maldevelopment of sort of the cognitive systems that have visual processing disorders. And so that's one of the research projects that I support. It's not mine in particular. And the other work that I do is to develop projects where we kind of create very holistic case studies of students and then provide sort of like what are the strategies and interventions that we use that we can teach families to do the work to support students, and as well as like just helping practitioners to understand interventions and strategies for CVI.
Hmm. It's really cool and fascinating. So, like, what are some of the things that you had to look at in order to determine what a student needs, a student with a visual impairment needs to succeed in their education? Um,
Yeah, that's a great question. So, a lot of times what I tell people is that I spend a lot of time helping grown-ups to understand their behaviors and differences that they have to make in their day-to-day. And so when we assess children with this and this visual impairment, we want to do a very holistic, comprehensive assessment that takes into account, medical histories and doctors' information, and in our field of understanding vision and how vision is related to functioning. My job is to understand if the child has, reduced acuity. So for example, do they need glasses? Do they have those glasses? What is their functional vision like? So how do they access the world? And if they can't access the world using their vision in a typical way, then what has to be in place to help them to access information? So what I frequently frame CVI is that it's a disorder of information processing. So for somebody with kind of a typical sensory system, we can be in a crowd of people and we can hear a lot of noise and we can take in visual information and we can kind of like integrate that and synthesize it, and we can understand what it means. But for folks with kind of visual processing disorders, it doesn't quite work that way for them. And so over the course of actually just this past year, now that we're kind of, post COVID and we're coming back together, I've had the good fortune to go to some conferences where we actually have individuals with CVI kind of telling us about their journey, their educational journey, and socially, like how they've kind of adapted and things like that. And what I would say is that what's most important for success is really understanding that even if a person has vision or has access to their vision, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can make the same sense out of it as you and I can. And we spend a lot of time kind of as a field of vision teachers trying to capitalize on a child's functional vision as much as we can. But I think the tide is turning a little bit. And what we've learned is that sometimes we just assume that seeing means understanding, and that's not the case. So many of these individuals who kind of they call themselves CVIers, many of these individuals will tell us, I've been forced to use my vision my whole life, and it's really, really hard. So how do we understand what, and build what we would call compensatory skills so that those folks can use maybe auditory learning or tactile learning in ways that are different? And so that's kind of the nut to crack almost in terms of CVI, is really figuring out what works for people. And because we deal with many people who have very severe and complex disability and can't communicate, we really need to do a good job of trying to assess holistically, like I said before, and understand what strategies are going to work for them.
hmm In figuring out what a student needs, particularly a student with a visual impairment needs to be successful in their education in the classroom, what kinds of stakeholders do you guys partner with in those efforts?
Mhm. Yeah, that's a good question. So, there are systems in place that are, basic special education systems where we really want to collaborate with therapists, so like occupational therapists, physical therapists, and special educators to understand, well, to kind of teach people about the students' needs, right, and how they access information. And then we also want to, and are supported by, administrators, but many times administrators don't really know a lot about visual impairment because it has historically been so low incidence, and so they kind of rely on their vision staff to do that. I would say at at kind of broader levels, we have quite a few highly specialized blind schools across the country, and we're trying to kind of get on board and be doing this work so we can better advocate, for our disability, basically our kind of area of disability. So the Perkins School for the Blind, which, as I mentioned, I used to work for, they have a very comprehensive and large support network for CVI. They have a website called CVI Now. If you ever get a chance to check it out, they have great information on there. They have courses, and they offer professional development for people to kind of better understand CBI and about it. And they also partner with organizations within Massachusetts, such as the Massachusetts Eye and Ear. It's like a teaching hospital, and the Harvard Center for Neuroplasticity, which does really great sort of like brain imaging work to show kind of what's happening in the brain for individuals with CVI when they're given certain tasks, and they're asked to do kind of functional activities, and that really informs our work because it tells us exactly kind of what people with CVI struggle with. And so how I see it is that we have clinicians that are stakeholders, we have collaborators at a federal level. So, for example, the National Institute for Health, they have a National Eye Institute within their organization, and one of their targets in their strategic plan for the next few years is actually ways to address this disability. And so we're seeing things kind of on a bigger scale, I think, than we have before. And we're also, because of that, seeing more funding for projects, which is very exciting. So, there's lots of stakeholders, there's lots of people that to educate. And when you raise awareness of this, you have people say, you know what, I think I've had so many students that have had this disability and I just didn't realize it. So that's kind of what we're working towards now, is raising awareness and at least being able to provide people with, validated and reliable tools to help us both understand risks for CVI and then comprehensive assessment to address it.
Uh-huh, yeah. My last question here is how can, education be used to like tackle the stigma of disability and, create a positive environment for people not only with visual impairments, but people with other types of disabilities? Because I get
Yeah.
there's like a lot of that in our society. So I'm wondering from that perspective, how do you go about doing that?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think it's very complicated. But one of the things that sort of motivates me is helping people to understand that for those of us without disability, the world is very much created for us, right? So I had a boss at a job once, and she asked me, she said, "Tell me how you're accommodated every day." And I was like, "Oh, I don't know. Like, is this a test?" And I got like nervous about it. And she was like, "Think of a cereal aisle. Think of when you're in the grocery store and you walk down a cereal aisle and think about all the choices that you have." Well, we all should have all those choices, right? And so when you start explaining to people how the world is accessible for them, and the little things that we take for granted, like, curb cuts, right? Like a bell on an elevator, like our phones, which literally, if you have a smartphone, which everybody does, it has so many accessibility features built into it, and so many things that were designed for people with disabilities, but that actually make all of our lives easier. So that's kind of the framework I usually provide to people, is that you don't realize all the ways your life is easier because of the tools that have been created for individuals with disabilities. And so if we think about and I work on a few projects now at UW that kind of are going to lend themselves to this. So that's very exciting. So it's thinking about inclusion and inclusive design in ways that we can kind of provide people, first of all, to understand inclusion, but also to understand that there are some pretty low barrier things that you can do as an individual, organization, or as a teacher to make the world or your world accessible for all learners or individuals with disabilities, you know? So whether that be by just rearranging furniture a certain way, you know, or providing something in multiple modes, like you doing this where you've got it on YouTube and you also have the audio and you have the video. So thinking along those lines, you know, because I think at the end of the day, there's probably a lot of very simple things that can be done, and people tend to get bogged down in it being complicated and expensive and not having the resources for it. But there are a lot of things that are pretty easy to implement that can help make, you know, whatever place you're working or your classroom or what or your business or whatever it may be, can make it more accessible for individuals with disabilities.
Yeah, I totally agree.